All right, we're back for another episode of Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is a conversation with leaders, community evangelists, accessibility advocates about the challenges that they've navigated throughout their accessibility journey. In this, guests get to share their journey of successes and setbacks. The primary focus is to talk about how they've overcome these specific obstacles. My name is Brian Gavin. I'm the co-founder of Wally, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Ian O'Bara. Ian, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Great to be on. Thanks for having me.
I'll have to admit, when I first met you, I think our first call, I was like, I'm not sure if Ian's all in for the podcast or not. And then you came back with such great enthusiasm, and it's been a pleasure getting to know you up till today. So let's dive into things. I always like to kind of kick it off with getting to know you a little bit, letting the audience understand your journey into accessibility.
For sure. So yeah, as far as my background, kind of what got me into accessibility is, when I was in kind of undergrad and in high school, I worked as kind of a direct care respite provider for adults and kind of middle school and high school aged people with different kinds of developmental disabilities, and I really enjoyed doing that, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to kind of be a social worker or not. Ended up kind of getting a technology degree in college and worked at kind of an IT kind of help desk staffing kind of firm for, support IT work for hospitals and stuff like that. And kind of was trying to figure out, like, I didn't think that was really what I wanted to do. And I was trying to figure out, like, is there a job that exists or like a career that I could do that would kind of merge what I liked doing kind of with accessibility and kind of making experiences better for everybody and kind of the technology aspect too. And so I did a bunch of research and I figured out there was kind of different like digital accessibility and user experience to a greater extent kind of was a career, and ended up finding a research lab that I worked at for a while I was doing my master's at Michigan State University, and really kind of got into kind of the digital accessibility piece there, which kind of led me to the role that I have now, kind of as a senior accessibility engineer at a financial services company, kind of helping ensure that all of the digital content we produce is going to work for our customer base of kind of any ability.
Such an interesting background, and I had kind of gotten to know you, like I said before the call. But interestingly enough, now the second conversation that's coming up this week around healthcare professionals, and that's the category you kind of come from, is going then into digital accessibility. I'm curious to know the influence the healthcare social work experience that you have, and then the research. How does that influence your mindset now as an engineer, creating accessible product? Yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, so what really kind of got me into it was seeing a lot of the different kind of technologies that people that I would be working with were using, and kind of what they liked about technology, and in a lot of cases how they were kind of driven to technology as kind of like an experience that they could participate in through like apps or different things like that. And that really kind of drove me to trying to figure out, and what I did a lot of my kind of grad research in was how can we kind of create digital experiences that will enhance the kind of communication ability or the ability to participate in society for different types of people. So some of the projects that I worked on were like developing a kind of a universally accessible mobile voting system and testing that with people with different kinds of disabilities. So that kind of like research background and trying to figure out, what is it about different pieces of technology, using, the WCAG standards as a base, but really trying to figure out like what builds a good experience for everybody. How do we make that kind of universally accessible? When is it better or not better to actually make something universally accessible versus kind of creating accommodations for more specific needs and more specific use cases? So yeah, I think to kind of go back to your question about that healthcare piece, it's really kind of the more personal experience of working with people, kind of seeing the challenges and the successes that people are having, and then wanting to kind of build upon that. So now in my engineering kind of role,
Hmm.
I'm able to take a lot of those experiences and still kind of participate in that research and kind of help define those into what requirements should be for software.
It's the application of the research and the healthcare aspect is so powerful. I often find that folks that join the podcast have had some level of influence. Yours definitely second this week, but certainly unique. And it's so interesting when you're sharing about the prioritization, right? I've had some conversation with folks around universal design system, but you kind of said something that stuck out to me, and I totally agree with the point, albeit maybe to some people controversial, but it's like when to be universal, when to be specific, right? Does it come naturally to you now as a developer, having obtained these kind of skill sets and these disciplines that allow you to think more holistically, or is it like, hey, I have to go back to this bounding box to see if I'm doing right?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes back to really kind of thinking about what the experience is that you were trying to build. So if it's something like the project that I had worked on for the National Institute of Standards and Technology for the voting system, really the experience of that is how can everybody kind of participate in voting, kind of using the same machine? Because some of the background research from that actually came with, people saying, hey, I would love to be able to go in and vote, but there are specific barriers that exist for me in using the machines and having to have somebody help me vote. It doesn't really feel like I'm participating in the same way that everybody else, that other people get to participate in. So if the experience you're building is kind of like something that everybody could kind of participate in using the same way, ideally, then yeah, I think kind of universal design can be helpful in that way, and is really a good lens to look at things through. Now, if
Mm.
it's something that is satisfying kind of like a specific need or is a specific accommodation, then yeah, I think that's where kind of tailoring things to specific needs, or to like specific accommodation needs, is definitely the right way to go. I think in most cases, though, for kind of like large web projects or a lot of kind of public facing things, those are things that everybody is going to want to kind of have access to or need access to. So making sure that everybody does have access is important. But that's not to say, again, that like everybody needs to access it the same way. And that's why, like within WCAG or within standards, there are guidelines around specifically like this is an accommodation that's going to work for this person or this person. You don't necessarily need to. You don't. People can access things in different ways. So I
Mm.
think universal design maybe isn't so much around like people need to access things in specific ways, but making sure that everybody can access the same information in whatever way kind of is going to work best for.
Yeah, I would be curious on the voting project that you worked on. Like, was usage even higher? I don't know if you got it's the usage part is so hard about some like the accessibility space, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have information on that. My kind of piece of it was in kind of
Yeah,
developing the prototype and then kind of submitting that research back. I don't necessarily know kind of like where that went beyond that, but
totally.
yeah, tracking that kind of adoption would be huge.
Well, it's so like one of the folks I was speaking with in the education space, the usage of the accessibility solutions, if you will, when it was sort of just openly available to anyone versus having to go and ask for someone, like you said, to help you vote, just went sky high, right? And so it's like you
Yeah,
end up building better experience, but it's no the data aspect of like being able to validate this. I feel like it would make this area of focus so much stronger. But then it's like, well, how do we share? I don't know, like could you get the iOS usage data, right? But they don't, it's privacy, right? So it would be I am just in my opinion make it more powerful in terms of how, like being a data driven accessibility framework?
Yeah, I mean, within organizations, just in terms of kind of what you were talking about with accommodations, when you do make, if you do kind of have accommodations, if you do kind of get rid of some barriers to people getting those accommodations and just say, like, hey, here are all the accommodations we have available. You don't have to disclose a bunch of stuff, but here's what we have available. Would any of these help you? You can go check them out or get them or whatever. Adoption of using those accommodations definitely goes through the roof, like you were saying.
Speaking to a fellow researcher, you probably actually have validated it. I'm just sharing the anecdote of having various conversations. So your journey into such a critical role today, I think, is very impressive. What are some of the challenges and the bumps in the road that you've faced mastering accessibility?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think some bumps in the road have definitely been, um, just kind of understanding and really trying to really understand people's experiences, and really trying to kind of get a good handle on the it's one thing to kind of understand what all the kind of requirements and standards are, but it's another to kind of understand the people behind them. And, we can understand why they're important, but yeah, I think that kind of empathy piece, or really understanding, like, and seeing how some of these standards actually, like, do make people's lives better, I think is really powerful, and I think is kind of a big kind of growing in this field step. I think another thing is, a lot of the standards and everything are really dense, and so kind of really getting a full understanding of kind of the spirit of what they mean and following kind of exactly what the requirements are, I think, is kind of another big hurdle. WCAG is a big thing for a lot of people to kind of get their
Mm,
minds around. It's really it's kind of technical. It's really dense. I think they do a really great job of explaining stuff on kind of the website and in their documentation, but I know that can kind of be a big hurdle for people. And then just making sure that we're kind of testing stuff in the same way and that it's going to be kind of scalable and repeatable, I think can be another hurdle for people, and coming up with kind of like what a good test plan for accessibility and making sure you're hitting all the things, is going to be, and making sure that you're including people with disabilities in your testing is huge as well.
at what point, like, I guess, do you remember when you faced these, like, early stage, or they, one of them, obviously you had said it takes to get a little bit more mature in the understanding of accessibility, but yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think early on, WCAG was really kind of hard for me to fully digest. It was also kind of difficult for me, I would say, at the beginning to really, as a sighted person, kind of understand kind of using a screen reader and using a screen reader in context. And I still, don't use a screen reader in the context that somebody who actually uses a screen reader as their primary way of interacting with a website that way is, as a sighted person. So I think really kind of checking myself and understanding, like, that my experience is going to be different, and making sure that we're including people who that is kind of their lived experience is really important. So kind of understanding that early on and
Mm.
getting over preconceived notions or other things about how I see the world, I think early on was kind of a good step to kind of get over and grow through.
I was just thinking about, like, does having the YCAG standards introduced in, college, post grad, is that helpful in the path of learning? I guess there's a massive amount of coursework, and the number of people that, you're trying are, I would say, in a level of, intermediary or entry level accessibility, it's huge, right? It's like, so how do you pick that gap up? Um, yeah.
Yeah, I think I was lucky enough to be in a research lab when I was in graduate school that was tied to accessibility, but the actual program I was in didn't necessarily like have classes on accessibility, and I think that's something that's kind of still growing and maturing. I'm not sure how many programs are out there actually at universities that have classes on digital accessibility where they talk about that kind of stuff and have classes dedicated to digital accessibility as a topic as part of user experience programs or computer science programs. It'd be great to see more of that. So I think, yeah, another big hurdle with that is it's something you kind of have to take on your own. There's lots of great resources out there. Like W3C has a lot of great stuff. There's lots of companies that have accessibility training courses and things that you can either take or maybe have made available through a company you work for or something else. But yeah, it'd be great to see kind of that built into curriculums in colleges and universities a little bit more for sure.
The amount of people that I speak to where, and even, within the last 2 years out of school and haven't had exposure. Now, would it be philosophical? Would it be technical? I guess it'd probably be because YCAG is very, it's multi-layered, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it would have to be kind of multifaceted. It would have to be, being learning like kind of the more technical specifications, but also understanding. I think there are some really good kind of like disability study programs out there. So in order to get the full context, you would have to kind of have the very human kind of more philosophical piece of it
Mm.
with kind of that more technical side of it as well. And I don't think you can really kind of succeed in this space fully unless you kind of have unless you kind of have both of those sides. Like I said, it's one thing to kind of understand the requirements, but it's another thing to kind of fully understand like why it's important and why you're doing what you're doing.
Could you identify in the code that you write the difference between something that code that is accessibly aware, I guess I would say, and non-accessibly aware? Like, what are the biggest differences, or is it even recognizable to you? I mean, I would imagine it is, right?
Yeah, I would say on the code side, I think that's where it would tie a little bit maybe more into the technical specifications. But in terms of kind of like the overall experience design, I
Yeah.
think that's where, and of course the code side supports that. Accessibility and usability are intertwined, and since it's really kind of hard to have a usable experience if it's not also accessible. So I think, there are some cases where, you might run into an experience that on the code side is, technically accessible and follows WCAG, but could still cause issues for all different kinds of people because the flow doesn't make
Yeah.
sense or because like the steps aren't right. It's one thing, to have a form that, validates correctly for semantic HTML and accessibility and everything. But if the overall experience of filling out that form isn't great, then it's probably still not going to be accessible from like, the more human standpoint.
How often are you meeting with your design partners, UI or UX? Are there other team members that you've found to, you know, probably a huge part of it stems there, right?
Yeah, it's definitely making sure that you're kind of plugged into what the design team is doing. Within my organization, I'm lucky enough to kind of be a part of the overall kind of user experience team. So I kind
Yeah.
of have like a direct in with those individuals. So we've done lots of things like training or making sure that like flows or experiences, our design system, kind of from a non technical side, still is usable in the sense that it's going to make experiences accessible for people, kind of going beyond if this color contrast is good or not, and more into like is the number of steps we're asking people to do in this phase, is that going to kind of wear people out? Is that going to be too much information for people all at once? I think WCAG does a really good job of coming up with requirements for different kinds of physical disabilities, let's say, like vision and dexterity and hearing and things like that. But one thing that I think that they're really starting to do now, which I think is great, is put more of an effort into developing kind of like standards and things around cognitive disabilities or other things as well. And we saw more of that in WCAG 2.2, where they introduced kind of some new standards around authentication into different applications and kind of how those more experiential things should work. And I'm hoping to really see more of that with 3.0 as well. So I think we've done a really great job kind of in the space with building out what those technical requirements in terms of how things should work with assistive technology. And now we really are kind of getting more into that space of what should the overall experience be like to make sure that it's going to be accessible.
Yeah, I mean, being able to kind of put some guardrails around the experience side, I think will be tremendous, because you hit the nail on the head when it's like, I can have validation in the form and essentially no fire alarms are going off. But in the same vein, is the experience good? And the number of steps I thought was a really good example too. It's like, I'm curious, as you were saying that, like, has the product that you're working on, or a multitude of projects, have you seen it evolve as you've had more immersive conversations with the broader team that's building the product?
Yeah, I definitely have. It's really important in a position like this to make sure that you're tapped into what all of the different product owners are doing and making sure you're working with them and with the design team to try to like refine what some of those experiences should be. Making sure that, let's say you're going back to the form example. Let's say you're taking kind of like a form that exists in like a print format and you want to make that into like a digital workflow. You're going to want to look at, you're not just going to want to take that form as it exists in the print format and kind of just change it over to be now it's a digital form on the website where you're gonna submit stuff, because that might not be the best experience. You might want to look at ways that you can, one, kind of let people know what information they're going to need ahead of time before they start the process, especially if it's going to be a process that's behind some kind of authentication where they might be forced to kind of like be timed out or something if it's like a financial transaction. And then just making sure that all of kind of those sections of information, maybe it makes sense to have like all of the information you're filling out about yourself in kind of one step, and then another step where you're filling out information about accounts or something else, just to make sure that, unlike filling out the giant kind of paper form, the reason why we're moving from that form is because it is kind of unwieldy and big to move and hard to get through. We want to make sure that we can kind of chunk that information out to be more reasonable for people to flow through digitally, or make sure this another good thing that kind of came out of WCAG 2.2 that I was really excited to see is now, especially with kind of forms, there's success criteria around making sure that if someone has entered information in previously that's going to show up somewhere else, that it does show up there, so people don't have to repeat steps in forms or things like that. And that kind of builds out that experience too. So that's not necessarily something that might like validate in the code, but if you're working on a project like that, that's something you could definitely kind of get ahead of with the development team and the product owner and say, hey, have we thought about these kind of like time-saving things that could exist for people that are going to make a better experience, but are also going to make it more accessible?
Yeah. And to be honest with you, I always hate when I have to re-enter
Yeah,
information
exactly.
on section 3 that was input in section 1.
Yeah. And that's where all this kind of stuff goes back to, usable experiences are accessible experiences. The cut curb effect of where they, when they cut curbs in the side of the road to make so people, with wheelchairs and stuff could get up. That made crossing the street easier for all kinds of people. It's the same thing with, when I watch videos, I always like to have the captions on. It helps me kind of better understand what's going on, and I don't miss stuff. Like, I don't need that as an accommodation, but it definitely makes my experience better. And so that's where I think a lot of these newer success criteria, which were developed kind of more for kind of the cognitive area, I think do kind of like make the overall experience better for everybody. And I think that's really powerful as well.
You hit the nail on the head. A better experience for all. Cool. So I always like to understand, as we close out the conversation, disruptions that you see coming into the accessibility space. We've touched on some just now throughout the conversation, but
Yeah, I think some kind of bigger disruptions coming are some that I see as positive and some maybe not so positive. The EU is coming out with kind of a new accessibility law that's going to be coming out kind of mid-year 2025. I think that's great. I really like what they're doing in terms of trying to kind of mandate that. I think how the market has kind of reacted to that in some ways is, instead of kind of opening positions for dedicated accessibility staff, kind of building accessibility into different roles that kind of already exist within organizations, which I think is great. I think everybody could benefit still from kind of dedicated accessibility professionals. But as long as, when those new roles are being created, or when those additional responsibilities are being tacked on to, let's say, a development role, a lot of development roles you'll see now for front end developers are also now starting to include kind of that it's a benefit if you have experience with accessibility, or they're looking for people with experience with accessibility. I think it's really a positive shift to see accessibility kind of more holistically being built into job descriptions. So I think that's a really good thing. I think the market in some ways has also reacted in saying, here are, or like with like the overlays, let's say, here are kind of, without building out the skills or the headcount maybe in your organization to get ahead of accessibility, here's maybe like a quick fix. And I think we see a lot of that kind of stuff with some of the overlays that are out there. And I think, kind of getting back to what our conversation has been about, that really does kind of wall people off or create a separate experience for somebody. And a lot of those don't really work great as experiences. And so, one, they kind of block people off from being able to participate in the web experience the way that other people are. And two, it doesn't really help the organization kind of grow or learn in accessibility so that they can kind of understand that technical aspect, understand the more human aspect, and really kind of be good stewards for accessibility and understand their customer base, and why people might need to access their site in a certain way. So I think that's been a really big kind of driver of a lot of those changes. I think it's great that we're seeing kind of more accessibility opportunities grow, but I also worry a little bit about, a lot of kind of the really heavily automated kind of testing, and saying like that because it validates with an automated scanner that's enough, or having some kind of overlay that creates a different experience for people is enough, I think is a little bit dangerous. So I hope most organizations kind of go the growing and developing their staff route.
yeah, I mean, just thinking back to, 3.0 coming out with the experiential vantage point. And I think the word that you're hitting for me is mainstream, right? Is like, instead of having maybe one dedicated person, I think a lot of what I've learned from you is being able to build overall better product and in the end goal, which is of course important. How do you solve that gap? How do you make something that WCAG philosophy, technical standard, there's, your UX and UI team members who need some level of understanding that's different than how you develop it. So it's such the knowledge gap is huge. And I don't know, is there a easy fix to it? You talked about some of the applications on maybe on the user side of it, but how do you plug the education side?
Yeah, education side is really big. You're definitely going to have some people who are really also really passionate and really kind of excited about growing and learning and accessibility. And some people who are never going to say that it's not important, but they're not as passionate about it as part of like it being a part of their job or everyday life. And so I think there's a really big balance between kind of what training you make available versus what training you make mandatory, and kind of upskilling people and empowering them to kind of own accessibility in their own space, but also still making sure that you kind of have like checkpoints or guardrails in place to make sure that you are kind of checking things and that there are kind of more hard and fast rules about what's going to work or what isn't going to work. So yeah, I think definitely making training available for people, really kind of giving them an understanding of the why it's important, and not just like, oh, then now there's additional requirements or there's additional tests that I have to run is really important. So I know a lot of organizations have kind of like communities of practice for different areas of the organization, whether it's like, the community of practice or like a center of excellence. Some places call them for like front end developers, somebody who is kind of in an accessibility role. I would really kind of encourage to make connections with those different areas and give kind of, as you're rolling out, like what the standard should be and maybe what some of the test plans are, how you want things to validate, and what some of those guardrails are. Make sure you're also meeting with those groups and with the product owners, who are kind of over those different teams, to make sure that you're really kind of hitting home like the why as well.
Love it. Well, amazingly, we're getting towards the tail end of the conversation. I always like to leave an opportunity if there's anything we didn't get to talk about or you didn't get to share today that you want to close out with. But it's been an amazing, enjoyable conversation.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate you inviting me on. This has been a great experience. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you again, Ian.